All right. Good morning, everyone here. We are very happy that Tim Kietzmann agreed to give a talk here. Tim is professor for machine learning in Osnabrück. I was lucky enough to hear a lecture or two by him in my undergrad in Osnabrück as well. And I'm really excited to hear more about his research now. And Tim, the stage is yours.
Great, thank you very much. So this talk is a bit of an experiment. I've put together slides that are typically from different talks and try to unify them into giving you an idea of what my lab does and why we do what we do and what the rationale behind things is, and give you a few examples of sort of projects we've done in the past to showcase the sort of work we do. We try to frame this overall research agenda as neuroconnectionism, which is a new term that a group of us, people working in the field, have coined, because it feels like what we do is distinctly different from typical AI and typical connectionism sort of work. And I'll explain to you in a little bit what that means. Okay, so catching brains with deep nets, neuroconnectionism is a framework for understanding neural information processing. That's the title. But let me maybe start with what my lab focuses on. What my lab focuses on is predominantly studying vision. So when I show you this image, you'll almost immediately be able to extract meaning from it, right? You'll extract that this is probably an animate sort of, well, let's say an animal. You can see fur, you can see colors, you can see ears, eyes, nose. I'm pretty certain that you haven't seen, I mean, if you're on Reddit, you might have seen this, but if you're not, you might not have seen this particular animal, at least not in the wild. And the reason is that this is, of course, a DALL-E creation of a hybrid cat dog. But still, you know, so to you, this is very clearly out of distribution. So it's not the typical element of things you see in the world, but you were able to do this remarkably robustly and remarkably fast. So our visual system really is incredibly fast in extracting information from the world. It's also very versatile. It's not only about recognizing cats and dogs, although ImageNet might seem like it sometimes. But it's also, you know, steering your bodily motion in various conditions. So it's also very reliable, right? Right now in Osnabrück, at least, it's raining outside and you can see just fine in the rain and in the sun. And your brain is very energy efficient in doing that. This, you know, comes at probably no news to you that the brain takes about 15 watts of energy, which if you look at the GPUs we use for our work, they take 300 plus watts per GPU, and typically we run 4 of them in parallel. So clearly the brain is doing something different. And the brain is very data efficient. So I can show you one, you know, cat dog example, and probably if I showed you another instance of a cat dog, you could say that's probably the same animal, although you've only seen one instance of it, right? So the question we're asking the lab is actually 2 questions. Can we learn from the brain to improve machine learning? So that's the one direction. Can we take inspiration from neural data to learn about whether we can improve AI or machine learning? And reversely, can we use machine learning to advance neuroscience? And that second question is predominantly what I want to focus on today. And again, in the case of vision. Oh, sorry, I should have added, if you have any questions, you know, I can see the room fine. So if you just wave frantically, I'll stop and explain stuff if you want. And we can make this take as long as we want and as short as we want. Okay, so so can we use machine learning to advance neuroscience? And so you know, it sounds like 2 related questions, but they are to us very related if you see them through the lens of deep neural networks. So what we try to do again is to try and take inspiration from neuroscience to improve machine learning, and at the same time use machine learning as a way of modeling processes cognitive computational neuroscience might be interested in. And really, deep neural networks to us provide a unified language for once, right? So that's new. I mean, not machine learning new as in the last 6 months, but you know, in the history of science and neuroscience, it's relatively new that we have this one framework that we can think about and have models that we train that are supposed to be vision models for neuroscience, that at the same time we can just take and run on real world data as a machine learning application, right? So to us, that's really a new way of looking at things. And that's why a lot of people download machine learning models now and apply them and see how good they are as models of the brain. I'll talk about that in a second, whether that is always a good idea or not. So in our work, deep neural networks are really central because they allow us for taking this interdisciplinary perspective and to, there's the German saying, of zwei Hochzeiten tanzen, dancing at two weddings at once, and they allow us to, jump between these two fields. So this is, neuroscientific inspiration for deep learning isn't a new question either, right? Our new thing. I mean, the whole idea of distributed coding stems from, multi-layer perceptrons, or the perceptron, people being interested in modeling cognition, right? That's where the whole thing started, thinking about distributed codes and, PDP models. And, I've listed a few things, there's more, where what we consider AI technology today has its roots in our understanding of the brain, right? Biological sparse coding led to sparseness, or L1 regularizers, Olshausen and Field famously having done that. Retinotopy and hypercolumns gave rise famously, as Jan LeCun says, to his ideas about convolutions, right? And now convolutions are quite essential. Simple and complex cells gave rise to max pooling. This was already the case in neocognitron, early models of that, that try to model the brain. And now max pooling is all over the place, of course, because it allows us to kind of summarize certain parts, certain features, to have, deeper feature maps and later layers, but not just explode the parameters, right? And again, there's more stuff here. So from the very beginning, deep learning was always inspired by neuroscience, I would like to argue, even though sometimes AI takes stuff and then engineers away from neuroscience. And I think that's what we've been seeing in the recent years, that better or newer models of AI are actually becoming worse at predicting brain data, right? So there was a time where, and you've had or heard of brain score before, right? In one of the talks before, I thought nodding or shaking heads would be useful, then I can. Have you heard of brain score before?
Maybe we can do a show of hands. Who has heard of brain score before?
A few. Okay. So the basic idea being that you can look at how much variance you can explain in brain data by using deep nets, right? And for a while, if you took models that were trained on computer vision tasks, the better models would lead to better or more variance explained. But that trend has ended. Right now, the better models, AI has kind of ventured away doing these benchmark things and lost touch a bit with the neuroscience community. And we're trying to pull that back. So this slide is moving us again a little bit back to inspirations for ML and neuroscience. And I call it ML neuroscience and the limits of human creativity. So when I started in computer vision, what we did was basically look at a problem and then think about ways in which we could solve it. Let's say you wanted to classify different fruit, and you would think, okay, probably color will be a good indicator, and maybe the aspect ratio or the major axis rotation or something of that sort. And you would write feature extractors and then run a support vector machine on top, or a classifier on top, k-nearest neighbor, whatever, or learning vector quantization. And the idea was that to solve that task, you had to be creative. You had to come up with features that you thought were useful for the task. Now with deep learning, that's very different, right? Since we have deep nets, this sort of feature engineering is less prominent because deep nets are trained end to end, which means you take a deep neural network, you throw large amounts of data at it, and the network will learn not only the classifier at the very end, but it will learn in every single layer features that are useful for solving the task, right? And famously, if you look at early the features that these networks learn in early layers, for instance, they look a bit like Gabors, which might remind you of selectivity in V1. So end-to-end training made deep neural networks so powerful. It also makes them so finicky to work with, because there's something like that's called shortcut learning, that these models learn in a way that we don't think they should be learning, but they find shortcuts in your data sets. But I guess the big freedom with deep neural networks came from the idea that you don't have to think about these features, but you can think of the features as being an emergent phenomenon in these networks that train to do a certain task, and for that they learn which features are important. And there's an interesting parallel here I would like to argue, and this is we can disagree on that, and I'd be happy to discuss. But I think we're a bit, if you think of cognitive neuroscience right now, where it feels like often, like in the classic cognitive neuroscience field, we're a bit stuck to where classic computer vision was. We think of experimental conditions that we can contrast, and then we do, you collect a bunch of faces and a bunch of body parts and a bunch of houses or cars, and then you contrast them, and then you get a map that highlights FFA and EBA and these things. But a lot of the things we've been doing in cognitive neuroscience is bound to these perhaps a bit simplistic narratives where we're bound to contrasting experimental conditions in many cases that we can label, because we think faces are a thing and houses are a thing, but and those are beautiful. They give us perfect control, and that we can give labels to things, and we like giving labels to things. That's why we call neurons face selective or body selective. But it's also a bit, so let's just say nature doesn't always easy answers, right? So it's not entirely clear that the brain would have neurons that very neatly align with concepts that we have in language, if you think about visual processing. And so deep networks give us a way of coming up with features that are geared towards a given task, but that we don't have to label, right? It is low-level features that are optimized for, let's say, object categorization. We can see how far we can get with that, right? So end-to-end training is what makes deep neural networks interesting for neuroscience also, right? Not just for deep learning, because we can get access to these features that are beyond the limits of our creativity, let's say. We don't have to label them, right? We don't even have to understand exactly what these features are. We just know they're low-level features geared towards a certain task. So that doesn't say that deep neural networks do not require a lot of expertise by people, right? The features themselves are trained by the model themselves, but there's other things we need to consider. And so they're higher level artificial neural network ingredients, right? So a neural network is defined by its input statistics, right? So what sort of images you put in will define the sort of features that it learns. Whether you put images in, or what type of images you put in, or text or audio, video, will all, whether you put grayscale images or not, or color images. This will change the features that the network learns, obviously. Also the task or the objective. You may want the images to be classified as one of 1,000 different object categories, which is what ImageNet is doing, which is a famous vision benchmark. But you might also say, well, I would like to do an unsupervised objective. I would like to do scene segmentation or action recognition, right? Depending on what objective you give these networks, they will learn different features. And the next thing is, the architecture will also define what sort of features these networks learn, right? If you put more layers, they will learn different features than if you have fewer layers. If you put more feature maps or skip connections, all residual connections, all these things define what features they learn. And the learning rule, of course, also defines what sort of features they learn. Do you use gradient descent as most people, or do you want some local Hebbian learning or evolutionary algorithms? So you can see now that the experimental degrees of freedom are still large in these models, right? I call them experimental degrees of freedom because it's the sort of stuff you can play with. You wouldn't play in deep nets typically with, the individual weights, which can be, in Alexnet, 80 million parameters, right? There's no way you would go in and hand tune those by hand, but you can define what sort of task you want to train your model on, right? And what input statistics you want to define. So the interesting thing in respect to neuroscience is that manipulating these various aspects enables us to test theories about the brain. You can take a network that's only feed forward and see how far you can get with explaining brain data, right? And that's what many of the brain score models have been doing in the past, and many of us have been doing. But then you can say, well, wait, but what happens if we add lateral or feedback connections? How does that change the features? Do the features align better with the brain or not? And so contrasting these models then is a way of hypothesis testing, just like you hypothesis tested early on to ask, do faces or bodies elicit a larger response in this population of neurons? Now you can say, if I train this model on these various different things, which of the tasks aligns best with the neural code, right? So it's still hypothesis testing. It's just the model underneath is way more powerful. And so the experimenter degrees of freedom are lower than the total parameter count in a model, which again, 80 million versus maybe 100. But that gives us a very powerful tool of thinking of what sort of mid-level and early visual representations the brain might be using and why. The why is an important question here because that's what normative models are here for, right? So asking why the ventral stream, I assume you know about visual neuroscience a little bit. So what the ventral stream is and what higher level visual cortex is and early visual cortex. Yeah, show of hands. Quick show of hands. Okay, everyone, perfect. Okay, so if you're interested in finding out, let's say, why IT codes the way it does, you can do a lot of experiments, but it's very hard to get that. You can say what it codes, you can do causal interventions, you can look at features, but why something does something is incredibly hard to do experimentally. But you can train models on multiple different tasks and see which task aligns best with the neural data. And that's what people have been doing with these category trained models for a while, right? Jim DiCarlo famously with Dan Yammans, also Nico Kriegeskorte and Sayed have done work in this direction, basically asking, if I train a model to be good at categorizing stuff, let's say using ImageNet or something, then how good are we getting at explaining brain data? And that led to this conclusion that maybe the ventral stream is here to categorize things, because along the ventral stream, you can explain a bunch of neural, let's say about 50% of variance by models that are trained to categorize, right? And now we can ask these normative questions, which I think is a very unique opportunity here. So what I've been describing in the past few minutes is basically that we use deep nets to test how good they are at explaining brain data, right? And explaining behavior. So that's one of the tasks, one of the targets that we'd like to do. We'd like to understand how the brain does vision by modeling it in deep nets, right? And for that, we try to see not only do they behave the same way, but we also would like to know, can we predict neural data? Can we find, from the input image to the behavior, can we fill in all of the different levels in between and kind of understand the whole process end to end? And at the same time, we cannot just go out and download, Alexnet or, GPT-3 or whatever the newest, architecture is and just run it on stuff. But we need to think about whether things are actually biologically plausible, right? Is the model I'm using to explain the brain roughly at least in line with some of the things we know about anatomy or neural coding, right? So we'd like to kind of bound ourselves, because there's multiple realizability, right? Which means you can have multiple different networks that perform the same way. And you would like to make sure that your model is at least at some level mappable to neural computations. And that is, again, a field in itself. But so the idea is that not only would we like to explain the whole path from input to output, including in between models and model neural data, but we'd also like to use neuroscience to guide us in finding the right architectures to model something. And that approach we like to call Neuroconnectionism. And this has been a discussion that's been going on among this group of people, including me, Adrian Jurek, Rowan Sommers, Katja Seliger. Adrian is a postdoc, or Rowan will be a postdoc soon in the lab. Katja works with Martin Hebert, and then there's Blake Richards. Janin is a philosopher of science. Blake is at Mila in Montreal. Grace, Konrad Körding, Taya Konkle, Marcel van Graven, and Nikolaus Kriegeskorte. We've been basically meeting up online in various formats and trying to figure out what it is like, because we all use deep nets to doing, brain science. We wanted to figure out, can we all unite behind this, one vision as to why we're doing what we're doing, to explain it to people. So the core of neuroconnectionism is that brain computations, representations, but also learning mechanisms and inductive biases are best understood by a modeling in artificial neural networks that are defined by their architectures, input statistics, objective functions, and learning rules. That's what I've been just telling you, I think. Multi-level and sensory grounded iterative models like ANNs are needed to model multi-level sensory grounded iterative brain computations. The idea here is, and that's a mouthful, I'm aware, but the idea is that you have to explain computations in the brain across multiple levels, also across multiple hierarchical levels. And your models, ideally, if you're after explaining vision, as many of us are, they need to be sensory grounded. You can't start from, well, this is a face and this is an object. Now let's contrast this, but you would have to have a model that can actually take pixels as input, or visual input, doesn't need to be pixels, but visual input, and kind of derive, face versus body from it. So we'd like to have actual models that start from the sensory input and not just at a high level. And we, often when we say, a region is face selective, we ignore the fact that somehow the brain came up with face selectivity from, retinal input, right? That whole bit we would like to also model. And neuroconnectionism focuses on modeling neural data as well as behavior, while integrating neural insights into the networks as a way of hypothesis testing. That's something that I think explained. So do you guys know what the Goldilocks zone is? Show of hands real quick. Some, not everybody. So in physics or in astronomy, the Goldilocks zone, it stems from the old, children's story about Goldilocks. But the idea is that in astronomy, there is a certain distance from the sun, which is habitable because it has water. It's not, and it's warm enough. So it's not too far away and it's not too close. And that's where we can live, right? And so this habitable zone is called the Goldilocks zone also. But this habitable zone, in that zone, we can search for life, for instance, right? So we'd like to apply the same principle here to modeling in computational neuroscience, where the brain is the sun. And now the question is, how far away from the sun do you want your model to be? And the idea is, if you're too close to the sun, you'll burn. And if you're too far away, you're too abstract and you can't make any statements about the brain anymore. And so we need something in between. And we think that a lot of ANNs that we use for modeling are in this neat Goldilocks zone of biological abstraction in this case. So another thing to consider here is that right now we have limited compute, right? So you have some GPUs that you have access to. I mean, we're blessed by having access to, a whole bunch of nodes with A100. So we have, I don't know, 320 gigabyte of GPU memory. That's a whole lot, but it's very small if you think of, the amount of computations you would want a brain to do. So if you have limited compute, you'll have to choose whether you would like to have more biophysically accurate models. So you could probably use all of those 320 gigabytes of GPU memory for modeling like 100 neurons with, intricate dendritic modeling. Or you could make simplifications about your neuron model and have more neurons that are then, able to do stuff from sensory input, right? And so you always have to make this trade-off. How much detail do you want to put in, and how much do you want this model to actually do stuff? And so ANNs to us are in that sweet spot where they have enough parameters in the model to encode domain knowledge. And domain knowledge is, again, something that you need to infer categories and information from sensory input. You need to know about the world and the structure of the world to do that inference. But at the same time, they're close enough to biology for us to make sense of it. So I like that picture, so I wanted to share it with you. We haven't shown this to anyone yet, but I like the idea of, if you're too close to the sun, you don't get insights because you have 5 neurons with all details. And if you're too far away, then you have super abstract models that do stuff, but they don't relate to the sun anymore, to the brain. Okay, so neuroconnectionism is, and I think I can probably skip this slide. The main take-home message is neuroconnectionism isn't AI engineering, because we're not after only task performance on some benchmark. No matter how you get where, it doesn't matter how you get there, just give good performance. But we're interested in how we get there, right? And that is distinctly different because we're interested in understanding brain computations. So neuroconnectionism focuses on understanding rather than performance. But if we would like to understand, and again, that's something that I've said before, but I haven't specified yet, is that we need to have a way to map between ANNs and brains, right? You can collect your neuroimaging data and you have a bunch of fMRI voxels, and then you have an ANN on the other end. Like, how would you compare those, right? It doesn't even, they don't even live in the same temporal space, or, you know, it's wild, right? They're so different. How do you make sense of this stuff? So we call that the Neuroconnectionism toolbox. There's a whole bunch of things you can do, and I'll go through them step by step. Is the figure like way too small for you guys, or is it okay-ish? Okay, and I see I see that it's sort of okay. Okay.
So we can't read any of the text, but I think
I'll just go. Okay, good. Sometimes if you have like huge screens, that works. Okay, so I'll just talk you through it. So the top here basically says, okay, one way we can map brains to deep neural networks is by looking at behavior. You can probe brains by doing psychophysics, and you get some reaction times and accuracies. And now the question is, can you do the same with deep nets? Well, accuracies you can get from deep nets, you can train a deep net on a given task, let's say image classification or object classification. And then you can train what we call a diagnostic readout. You can say, okay, let's say my task is now you put humans in a psychophysics cubicle, and then you ask them for a bunch of stimuli, is this an animate or an inanimate object, right? That's something we could do. And then you can take a deep net and you train it on the same thing with a bunch of animate and inanimate objects. And then you can ask the same question. You can then later show the same stimuli as what you have shown to the people to the deep net. And you can ask, would the deep net make the same choices as people, right? So that's one way how we can do this. Does that make sense? Right? I mean, behavior is easy, right? That's just the output of the thing. Then you can look at, but I said earlier, we don't only want to map onto behavior, we would also like to map onto actual neural data. And how do you do that? Because again, the feature spaces are so vastly different. One thing that people have used among the very first things to compare these models to brain data was using RSA. It's not the rational speech act, it's representational similarity analysis. Have you heard of RSA before? Show of hands. This is more interactive than you wished at the early morning, right? Okay, so some of you. Okay, so RSA, I'll just give you the basic idea. The idea is that you train a model. Again, the idea is always you train a model on something, and then you freeze all the weights, and then you leave it as is, and you just probe into it, right? So you can now, let's say, you take. I might have a slide on that actually later on. Let me show. Here, I'll show you this slide. What you can do in the top left. So what you can do is you show, let's say, 100 different images to people in a scanner, and then you would like to characterize for a given brain region what it does. How would you do that, right? You could do the simple stuff and say, well, some of these objects have faces and some have bodies and some have cars, and let's just do a decoder and decode, you know, using support vector machines or whatnot, whether I can decode that. Or you could fill in a whole distance matrix. Can you see my cursor?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So you can fill in this whole matrix by computing distances. You get a vector response from the brain. Let's say IT, let's just make up numbers, is 300 voxels. It's probably more, but let's just say the region you define as IT has 300 voxels. So you get a vector response for each image, right? So showing a face gives you a vector response. Showing any other object, you know, guy and a dog playing frisbee in the park, image will give you one vector response in that brain region. And now the idea of RSA really is that you compare distances between these responses. And if a brain region cares about a distinction, there will be a large distance between these concepts or these images. If it doesn't care about it, there will be a small distance, right? And you can see here in this plot nicely that if you show a bunch of objects for which half of them are animate and half of them are inanimate, to people in the scanner, and you go with human IT, you can see these quadrants forming, which means human IT cares about whether something is animate or not. As soon as something's animate, it's similar to all other animate things. And if it's inanimate, then it's very different in the response. Very different being a large distance in the responses. And so you can do that with brains, obviously, but you can also do the same thing with deep nets, right? You show the same images as what you've shown to the people to the network. You get vector responses. So they're not brain voxels now, but they're units in the deep net. And then you just do the same distance sort of calculation. And it turns out, but this is actually later in the talk, but it turns out if you train a model on object categorization, it ends up emphasizing similar dimensions, animacy, or whether something is a face or not. But you haven't taught it to do animacy. You haven't taught it that faces are special. It's just the case that this model learned that these sort of distinctions are useful for object categorization, right, by themselves. And you can compare these matrices. You can take the matrix to the left and say, well, that's what humans look like. And you can take the matrix to the right and say, well, that's what the DNN said. And you can do a Spearman correlation between them, right? You can ask how, or I mean, if you want to go crazy, you can do a Pearson correlation, ask, how much variance can I explain in the neural distance matrix from the deep learning matrix. Does that make sense? As a very high level description of what it is. Okay, another thing you can do, that's the third line here, is known as encoding models. That's probably like an equally frequent way of mapping between brains and models. And the idea is here is you take an individual voxel, or you take an individual neuron, and you compute. Actually, I have that here. So you take an individual neuron, and then you show it a whole bunch of different objects, and you record the firing rate of the neuron. And now what you would like to do is you show the same images to the network. You do cross-validation, obviously. You take a training set and a test set and so on and so forth. But you show the same images to the network, and the network gives you, a very distributed response across all of its units in a given layer. So you would like to explain one neuron, the firing rate of one neuron, but yet now you get this vector response in the model. With RSA, we just worked off of the vector responses in the brain and in the model. Here, we would like to explain individual neurons. So what you can simply do is take the responses of the brain to those stimuli and learn a linear mapping. So to say, can I predict from the pattern response in the brain, in the deep net, what the firing rate of this individual neuron is? It's basically just a huge GLM, a huge regression, right? Each unit in the network is a predictor, and you try to predict the firing rate of a neuron. And then you kind of regularize the whole thing, because otherwise you go nuts with the amount of data and the amount of parameters. But that's, basically a regularized GLM is what was renamed to be an encoding model in a very successful renaming sort of intervention by some in the field. This is now known as encoding models. So, yeah, and what that gives you is sort of like something like this. You can have the model predict individual firing rates of a neuron to unseen stimuli, and this can give you, let's say in V4, some of these models can explain, I don't know, 50% of variance. So you can see that the alignment between the images that the neuron cares about and doesn't care about is quite good in the models and the neuron here, right? So the model can successfully predict individual neurons' firing rates. You can take that a step further, and that's been shown recently. Then you can now you have a model that can predict for individual neurons how well they can, how strongly they would fire. Now you can just play around with the stimulus space and say, okay, so what fake stimulus could I create that the model would predict would give an even stronger response in this neuron, right? You're not bound to the stimuli you've shown to the neuron. You can just play with the model now and just change around the images, and then you can come up with input images or stimuli that the model predicts will drive the neuron even more than natural stimuli. And it turns out that works. So Jim DiCarlo has done this in the lab. They record from neurons. They run this whole thing while the monkey is still being recorded. And then they can change the stimuli and show those stimuli also to the monkey. And they can show that they can drive IT neurons beyond any natural stimulus that they had tested if they, have this mapping from a deep net to a neuron, right? And that's quite exciting, because that feels a bit like a causal link, right? Okay, so that's, two big ways in which we compare neural data to networks using RSA and using encoding models. But you can also just play around with deep nets, and you can, start cutting connections and see how it affects behavior, right? You can also decode from deep nets as you can decode from the brain, doing searchlight and whatnot. You can also do individual neuron selectivity, do it, what we typically do as deprime, let's say, in individual neurons or behavior. You can do that with a model. There's nobody, nobody can prevent you from doing that, I guess. So, deprime will work for both models as well. And you can look at the development or the developing.
Sorry,
brain.
Tim.
Yeah.
Are losing connection.
That's not good. Are we coming back or no?
That is very true.
See, I even went to work so that my internet connection wouldn't drop off.
I think it's probably us. It looks like it's us.
Give me 2 seconds. I'll check next source whether the others have issues or not. Or actually, let me test this here.
Einfach mal restarten. Ja. Das ist eine gute Idee. Ich mache mal hier. Ja, das Can you hear us, Tim?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
I think it's perhaps better now. We
you took away
the
my
camera away.
Back, but okay, good. So you have to show of hands is now over, but maybe we'll recover it.
We'll keep the audience.
Yes, I can just tell you roughly how many hands there are.
Okay. Maybe in 5 minutes we'll try turning it on again.
Yes, that sounds good.
And you tell me how I do on time. Do I have like, I don't know, 3/4 of an hour left or so, roughly?
You have spoken for about 40 minutes, so that means you have 50 minutes left, including questions.
Okay. So so all I'm saying here on this slide is basically, if you train models and you would like to use them to understand parts about the brain, there's various different ways in which you can map behavior and neural data using RSA and encoding models. You can look at, you can do lesion studies in the models that you couldn't do ethically in the brain. Can you hear me better now or no?
It's better, but not great. We're just checking.
Let me check next doors. Let me check something next doors. I have a suspicion.
Okay. Looks a bit like it's both of us. Okay, good point. Thanks, Tobias, for pointing that out. All right, then.
Okay, my suspicion was not correct. Then the neighbor office says they have perfect internet connection on it. So, and I'm on the same.
I think it's probably us. Some people on Zoom said that they can hear
Zoom,
you well.
okay.
So
Perfect.
It must be us. So I'll just disconnect and reconnect quickly.
Okay. People on Zoom, you can take that time and ask away if you have questions.
Any questions?
Thanks for the feedback that you can hear me well. Otherwise, I would have. Yeah, that's a good question, Tobias. So the question that Tobias is asking in the chat is whether we considered how to differently approach something like face differentiation, which has developed through evolution, and object differentiation that develops in lifetime. So some of the projects in the lab that unfortunately I don't have in this talk think about how maps form in inferior temporal cortex, and there we look at whether you need exposure to faces to get like face selective maps, right? And studies have been done in the macaque, of course. So you can do this experiment, right? You can ask how well is a given architecture equipped to do faces, even though you haven't seen any faces, speaking for like an evolutionary bias. or you can, and you can have different amounts of faces shown to it, and then try to differentiate like that. And at the same time, we look at the development of selectivity for words, or written words, and that is evolutionary, arguably too new to have been encoded in our genome. So that's something where we know of the brain that this is developing in the lifetime, and we try to reproduce that in models as well. Okay, Celine, that's a great question. So the question,
Tim,
yes.
could you repeat that question out loud for the audience here in the room?
Yeah, no, I was about to do that when you.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Celine's question is, why exactly is a model too close to the human brain, like burning from the sun? Is it just because it's too complex and takes a lot of computation and details we don't know yet? Or should this, in a perfect world with unlimited computation power, be the goal, a model that's almost replicated of the human brain? So that's a good question. And I feel very strongly that we can reproduce brains, right? We can have children, for instance, they have brains, but just having another brain doesn't explain anything about the nature of computation in yet another brain, right? So our idea is that you need some level of abstraction to think of computational principles, connectivity motifs, and so on, that we can try and understand what drives neural computation. And part of the whole program is to start, simple with convolutional networks like now, which are very far away from the brain still, and integrate biological detail like recurrence or other things as we go along, so that we can test which features have which computational function on this more abstract level, right? So I wouldn't be happy personally, but there are different views held by different people, but I personally wouldn't be happy if you had a huge hall of GPUs and said, that's running a brain right now. And I wouldn't feel satisfied as an answer to why we are the way we are and why cognition arises from, multiple different factors. I would like to abstract from it and experiment on it to understand. Hope that makes sense. Cool. Those were two really cool questions. Thank you. Should I go on with the talk, maybe?
Yes, it seems like the connection issues are settled for now. So let's hope it'll stay that way.
Right. Okay. So what I've put here is something you definitely can't read. It's all part of a preprint we're putting out as we speak, like next door. So basically, this is showing you the history of neuroconnectionism, because I mean, we term it like that, but of course, people have used network models for a long time. We just think that now is a time where we have evolved sufficiently far from the old connectionist models and high-level act art style cognitive models, and our focus is different, that we have the right to rename this as a new endeavor. And I'll probably just skip over this. This is basically just showing you across time where we started with Fukushima and the neocognitron, him taking ideas from Hubel and Wiesel, who had found simple and complex cells, and had this idea that complex cells are doing some sort of max operation over simple cells in early visual cortex. And he built this into a hierarchical system that used unsupervised learning rules, way ahead of its time if you look at it. And then we moved on to HMax and the Poggio lab and so on and so forth. So the field really has evolved quite dramatically, staying, however, for the largest part with a class of models that are feed-forward. And feed-forward models are, the idea is that you take an image as input, you compute something, and then you go from layer to layer to layer, and you just use the previous computed features and you recombine them in a certain way to get more complex features, right? You can combine edges to get corners or textures, right? And from multiple corners, you can maybe get a shape and so on and so forth. But the idea is always that you go straight from the input to the output. You never go back. And that's quite different to the brain, where we have ample recurrent connections, right? Where nearby neurons talk to each other in lateral connections, and top-down feedback exists, where high-level cortical areas speak with lower cortical areas. So recurrent neural networks are a big focus in my lab. And so that's what I want to spend the remainder of the talk speaking about. This is a slide you've seen before. The idea is that in 2012, Alexnet came out, right? Which after a long winter of deep nets being, including me, deep nets being used by like a fringe group of people who thought they would be useful someday. In 2012, Alexnet came out, and it was a computer vision model that won a very important challenge, the ImageNet large-scale visual recognition challenge, ILS-VRC. And basically, it blew all the competition out of the water that had used more traditional computer vision. And they had used a deep net, a convolutional deep net, to do that task. And so people in the neuroscience community then thought, well, actually, if they're trained on a given task, categorization is something we've been thinking that the visual system might be doing, because we've got all these, people had shown that you can decode from IT an object's category, within 100-something milliseconds, and that fitted quite well, right? So 100 milliseconds is maybe enough for predominantly feed forward. Well, that's debatable, but it's maybe predominantly, let's say, feed forward. And so they thought, let's use these models and compare them. And so Sayed Khaliq-Razavi has shown that if you train deep neural networks on this task of object categorization, then they will emphasize the same large-scale features as we see in the human brain, for instance. And Umut Güçlü and Marcel van Gerven have shown, using an encoding models in humans, that early visual cortex is best predicted by early layers in a model, and later visual responses are better explained by later layers in the model. And so it's not only that this model by Sayed had only looked at IT, so only among the higher levels of visual representations in the human brain. And now Umut filled in this question of whether deep nets actually are good for modeling the whole cascade going from input to output. And they showed this nice transition from early layers for early areas and late layers for late areas in the brain. And similarly, Dan Yammans and Jim DiCarlo have shown that intermediate layers of a model are best to predict V4, which is also an intermediate area in the brain, so that these match best, and later layers best match to IT, which is again a high level area. So there's this nice correspondence, and from that, people started claiming that deep neural networks are not only the current best model, because there's no other model that could take an image and predict neural responses as well as these deep nets. So they're not only making that claim, they're also claiming that the brain might be, or the ventral stream might be optimized for categorization, right? And that's something that we now know is maybe a bit too simple or too simplified, but I still stand by the claim that deep nets are the current best models for capturing neural firing rates. And this is a statement that has led to a bit of controversy, because people look at some of the behavioral work in psychophysics and say, well, but deep nets often behave quite differently from the brain. And that's entirely true. We're just saying they're the current best model that you can compute off of actual input images, right? You could come up with a better drift diffusion model for some of the psychophysics, but you would have to put in, let's say, the experimental conditions, right? The models couldn't extract the experimental conditions from the stimuli. You have to intervene and take your brain to put a label on the input image to then run a simpler model, right? That works. But for like an end-to-end sort of model of computations, I think there's no way around deep nets. Okay, so people have published this work on using feed-forward networks to predict brain data, and we were all quite excited about this development. And now everybody is, and I did this slide a while ago. Now you could add 100 more papers where people use feed-forward networks and they compare them to brain data. And here's an important thing, though, that if you're modeling, just because models, and I mean, I'm guilty as everyone else is, right? We've done this. But one thing that people forgot is that if you model, then the structure of your model is your implied hypothesis about it, right? So if you take Alexnet, you just download it, you make the assumption that you can capture your process with a feed-forward model that is trained to categorize. And so we can ask, is that a valid assumption about human vision, right? Are we here to categorize stuff, for instance? Or we could ask, and is that sensible, right? Given that these deep nets use, 1.5 million images that have labels to learn what a dog is, right? That's clearly different from what people are doing. So we don't have as much supervised training data. And at the same time, we also know feed forward is probably not the right way, right? So we asked in a follow-up project, okay, well, if we're true to this, so that can, let's say, give rise to questions whether that's a good idea or not, let's just say. And we tested whether that's a good idea with Kate. And we tested basically all that, sort of prominent feed-forward deep nets that were present back then. Alexnet as being like the first, and then BGG and GoogleNet and ResNet and MobileNet and Inception and whatnot. And we basically asked, okay, if we train this model on a task and then we allow a bit of flexibility in how we read out from the model to predict brain data using RSA, how good can we get? And it turns out, the summary is to the right here. It turns out that if you don't train the model and you don't fit it to the neural data, you're at like 0.1 correlation. But if you train it and you don't fit it to the data, you get better. So training gives you better features that are more aligned with the brain. But if you allow a bit of flexibility in reading out, you can actually get quite far in predicting or in terms of alignment with neural data. But the astonishing thing then was that if you take these various different feed-forward networks and you do these two things, you train and you fit, then all of a sudden, basically all of them, you see that, like, how little the variance is here. All of them do quite well, right? And none of them does significantly different from another anymore. So the whole class of feed-forward models, although they're quite different in computational performance on this object recognition task, they all perform more or less the same in predicting brain data. And so that was a kind of a bummer then, but also great, because they are all unified by this one view that they all rely on feed-forward computations that are bound to classify, which I had on the previous slide. So we think it's really time we move on and we think of other models, right? So now, again, this is not engineering, this is neuroconnectionism. So what we'd like to do is to look for further inspiration as what we could change best about our models to make them align better with neural data. And this is a slide that is inspired by a slide that Jim DiCarlo has shown once to me in a workshop that we've been together. So some people might say, okay, well, if you want to capture like actual brain computations, you can't do static feed-forward computations. You need population dynamics, right? Lower dimensional manifolds and so on. That's what you should be doing. And other people might say, well, but also neurons are spiking and you use ReLUs, right? So ReLU activation functions in deep nets, basically being the units are 0 and otherwise just linear in their response, right? And that's nothing like how the brain is communicating. The brain is communicating using spikes. So, why don't you use spiking neural networks? Then people would say that dendritic computations can do XOR, and that's something that's kind of a feature that you shouldn't be missing. So you should be, having complex dendritic computations. And then, the biologist comes in and says, channels are sort of important and you need to do all the channel dynamics in your model. And also, protons are important, and it never ends, right? There will always be someone working at another level who thinks their level is more appropriate for studying the brain. And so I've shown this with the Goldilocks zone before. I don't think we should start from the bottom. I don't think we should start modeling intricate channel dynamics just for the sake of it, right? We should be, I think, modeling things from the top down. So we have feed-forward models, they work quite well, but now let's make them better. And so we can make them better by testing for population dynamics, for instance. We can make them recurrent, right? And then later on, we can think about spikes, but each time we can see how far we get, because it could be that some of the biological details, and that's important, some of the biological details that we see in the brain are like the appendix in your belly, right? we don't use it for anything. It's like evolutionary baggage. And some of the computational principles in the brain that you see in the biological brain might be just, you know, evolutionary baggage. Unfortunately, I don't know whom, but there were people, you know, there was a workshop, I think once that said, you know, gamma oscillations, the exhaust fume of neural computation. And I think that being as critical as it gets, it's also an interesting point that was raised. How do we know that certain computations we see in the brain are actually important for the way the brain it computes, or are we just observing stuff that's kind of a side effect? And we think that taking this top-down approach, we can test which features are doing what sort of weightlifting in the computations. Does that make sense?
A lot of people nodding.
Okay, good. Good. I'll see how I'm doing.
We have one question, actually two.
Okay. You want to try the camera again?
Yes, let's try it.
Let's risk it.
The microphone, is it connected? Yes,
Yep.
you hear this
Yeah,
one.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. Then... Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Great. My question is, you alluded a bit to this kind of question about to what extent can we infer, based on the fact that models for categorization work so well, are predicting the ventral stream, that the ventral stream is somehow also doing categorization. And I understand that there's some tension there that you alluded to. My question is, to what extent do you think that the task that we use to train these networks is really important at all? Or is it more the fact that for categorization, we happen to have a lot of labeled data that makes testing that makes it easy to train these models and kind of gives them a rich feature space?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think a lot of the history in the field stems from, and that's an uncomfortable truth, a lot of the models we used out of computational convenience, right? Training deep nets when we started in this, that was hard. Like there was TensorFlow didn't exist, PyTorch didn't exist. Just coding up models to, you know, we had thousands of lines of code just to make sure that we could parallelize our models across multiple GPUs and wait for the right GPU to kind of, you know, it was really hard work. So if somebody came in from the engineering side of things and said, here's a model trained on this engineering task of categorization, do you want to try this? Of course we did, right? So it aligned well in the sense that in the neuroscience community, there was this thought that the ventral stream, and Jim DiCarlo and others had been pushing for this idea, Tommy Poggio as well, that the ventral stream is trying to untangle representations and give you more and more invariant representations that code for object category, right? And the idea is that you can decode object category from higher level areas better than from earlier level areas. And so that aligned well with this object categorization task from the engineering side, right? At the same time, people in biology thought that, or neurobiology thought that feed-forward processing, you once sweep through your ventral stream is enough to give you category information, because you could decode category after like 90 milliseconds, right? It's quite early. And that fit well with the sort of feed-forward architectures people were using. So it was kind of a perfect match. So people started using them. And in Sayed's paper, for instance, he contrasts these category trained models with a lot of unsupervised objectives, and he showed that they work just better, right? So that's where this narrative comes from. Now we have unsupervised objectives, and it turns out that they can be just as good as at explaining some of the neural firing rates. So now, where do we go with this, right? So the idea, I think, of many in the field, or at least in my lab, is that unsupervised objectives might be the heavy weightlifters, right? Because we just, as people, don't have that much access to labels. But separating things out into, you know, labels might still be important on top of it, right? But it's an empirical question. Which objective? It's like a hunt for like a holy grail. What's the normative task of this of a single region, for instance, right? Not even clear that the whole the ventral stream does the same objective, right? They could all have different objectives. Right? Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, but there was also one more question in the chat, if I'm not mistaken.
So the chat says, with spiking neural networks and neuromorphic hardware gaining some traction, what are you missing or perceive as the greatest lacking feature to be an option for the next step? So that's again a great question. So a large part of the field is still obsessed with feed-forward networks. And my lab has been pushing hard to make recurrent models more visible, because I think that just adding lateral and top-down connections gives these models such more diverse and different ways of expressing that we think that's kind of what we would like to do first, like stay true to like the stuff we can train. So spiking neural networks are incredibly hard to train, right? Often people train feed-forward convolutional networks, and then they take the weights and then transplant them into spiking neural networks, because spiking neural networks are just horrible to train. So we hope that, you know, adding recurrence and staying in this non-spiking domain will give us a lot of explanatory power already. And we're not quite there yet to go for spikes, because it's a whole box of Pandora in its own. But I'm happy that people are working on that, and a new PhD student entering the lab and another one in the lab have experience with neuromorphic computing, and it's something we'll venture into, but slowly, right? Okay, good. So more questions?
Not in the room, I think. Also not on Zoom, as far as
I like that that you can throw the mic, but you need a second one. If it's a bad question, you can just throw a second one at the person, right?
Well, we'd have to use a water bottle.
Okay, good. Okay, so the question is, where do we look for inspiration, right? What we do spiking neural networks next, or what are we doing? So for us, really, the idea or the solution is about time, right? Which conveniently is the name of our ERC grant. But so if you look at this, I mean, many of you, who has not seen the Velleman and Van Essen diagram in the last
Zero hands raised. No, a few hands raised.
Well, okay, if you've grown up in any like visual neuroscience lecture ever, probably this will have been shown to you. And it's what Velleman and Van Essen thought was the connectivity of the visual system in the macaque, right? And a lot of models, feed-forward models, would show this and say, okay, layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, up to, you know, prefrontal cortex. But what they miss is that most of the connections that they drew are actually bidirectional, right? It's not only the case that V1 only talks to V2, V2 talks back, right? And so this largely recurrent structure is something that we would like to explore what it means in terms of computations. Now I'll jump over a whole lot of slides so that we, having 20 minutes left, have enough time to do that. So the first thing we did in the lab, and I'll just speak over this slide and not show you the actual data. The first thing we did in the lab was to say, okay, if we're interested in neural population dynamics and recurrence, feed-forward networks really can't do that, right? A feed-forward network will always just give you one response and one response only, right? It computes the thing, you get one response. That's not doing any dynamics. That's not giving you reaction times. It's not none of that. And recurrent models can give you that. But we wanted to know, you know, can we model brain data using these models? And can we test how far we can get with recurrent models versus feed-forward models? So what we did was a bit of a trick. So the idea is you collect data from the brain using, you know, RSA again. This is the same sort of structure as what I showed you before. And then we ask the brain, okay, if you see an elephant or a pineapple, how different are they in this, you know, region and time point? How different are these? And then the brain might come up with like, okay, 0.8, they're 0.8 different. And then you show the same images to the network and it comes up with this response. No, they're actually 0.2 different for the model. And then you could say, well, actually, if I want the model to be human-like, that's an error, right? It should be 0.8. If it were a human, then elephant and pineapple should be 0.8 away in the neural response vector, right? And so you can use that and derive gradients. You can train models so that they follow the same representational structure as what you see in the brain. So basically, you could train a model to, so if you don't only do, you know, obviously not only elephants and pineapples, but you do 100 objects, and you do all pairwise comparisons between these 100 objects, you can get this whole representational structure, all of this, this dissimilarity matrix that I talked about before. And what you can do is you can train a deep net to predominantly try and fulfill or come up with a representation that is similar to the brain in terms of these distances, right? So you're not trying to have each unit model an individual neuron in the brain or a voxel, but you would like to have the same representational structure or geometry. If the brain cares about animacy, the model should also care about animacy if you train it to be brain-like. Does that make sense? As a hand?
Well, we definitely have one question. So,
good.
Could you throw the mic?
Yes. So you're saying that you want to train these networks so that the representations that they form are in the same kind of space than the representations of the brain.
Same geometry, yeah. But same distances between responses.
But wouldn't that imply that you could then find a match between neurons? Because
not necessarily, because distances here are, that's a good question, thank you. Not necessarily, because distances here are computed, let's say, by computing a Pearson correlation distance, right? And so you're only interested how correlated are two populations, and that doesn't mean if two populations have the same correlation as two other populations, then it doesn't mean that the population units are the same.
I thought you meant like you would keep you would have like some similarity measurement, like Euclidean distance or something.
Still, you could even have one neural population, which is 10 neurons, and you could have a deep net with 1,000 units, and you could still try and get the same, you could still do Euclidean distance in each, and then ask, how do the two compare by correlating these two matrices, right? So it doesn't have to be a one-on-one mapping. And that's the strength here, I guess, because we don't want to make that assumption that each unit in the model corresponds to a single neuron, right? Sometimes we think of individual units in a network as a whole population of neurons, for instance. Okay, but you can, and this, goes completely against this normative idea that I've talked about earlier, right? Where we said, let's train a model only on a given task and then compare how similar it is to the brain. Now what we're doing is we're trying to push the model to be as similar to the brain as possible using brain data, right? And that you might think is cheating, right? Because now we make the model more like the brain. And of course it will be more like the brain if that's what you train it on. The idea here is that we would like to contrast different model architectures, feed-forward and recurrent and so on and so forth, to ask, if we were to train a model to be as brain-like as possible, there will be some architectures that can do this and some architectures that cannot do this, right? And if we're interested in understanding the brain, it would be silly to rely on a structure that couldn't even be like the brain if we forced it to, right? So we should use an architecture that can be like the brain under the right circumstances. And that's what we do with this. So now what we do is we contrast two models, two types of models. One we call ramping feed forward, and one we call BLT, which is not bacon, lettuce, and tomato. It's bottom up, lateral, and top down. But you can see that we adjusted the colors to be like bacon, lettuce, and tomato, obviously. So ramping feed forward, why not a straight up feed forward model? Well, because we want to compare to MEG data in humans, and feed forward models again have no dynamics whatsoever, right? And that's what we're after, population dynamics. So again, a feed forward model just gives you one response, and we thought that was sort of boring because of course a feed forward model will be worse. So we gave each unit a connection to itself. So units can ramp up their activity over time slowly, and they can learn this parameter as to how slowly they want to ramp up. And that gives you a complex nonlinear system. And we asked, okay, if we had a feed forward model where computations can only go from a unit to itself or forward, how good can that be as modeling dynamics in the brain versus, a fully recurrent model, which is still convolutional? Now I'm going to show you a movie. What you see in the left is something that we characterized from area V4 and LO. This is an RDM, so a dissimilarity matrix again. And I'm showing you across time how these things evolve, right? If you were to record from before using source reconstruction techniques and MEG, this is the sort of structure you would see. I won't have time to go into detail of what that structure is, but we can just look at the sort of how dynamic this is. How much does the code in V4 and LO change over, the first few hundred milliseconds? And then you have a BLT model next to it, which is the recurrent model, and you have a like feed-forward sort of model next to it. And we'll just look at which one is more like the brain. So I hope you can see the, can you, oh no. Why are you doing this? Oh no. Yes. So you can see that there's a lot of, this will loop, just for information. There's a lot of structure in V4 as it evolves over time. The code changes quite dramatically. For a split second there, it emphasizes very strongly whether something is a face or not. And then it goes to into a code that emphasizes animacy over other things, and so on and so forth. And you can see that the BLT network was very closely able to follow that. And again, this is cheating in a way that we enforce the model to be like the brain, but it's only half cheating because we used other stimuli to train the model, and we used half of the brain data to train it, and now we're testing against the other half of the data, right? So we do cross-validate. So it's not just heavily overfitted on the actual data.
So
you can see.
What are you changing? Oh, sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
What are you changing here in the brain? So
nothing. So this is
where the similarities
brain. This is the dynamics of a brain staring at a static picture. So in the left, it's literally a cascade of computations happening in V4 and LO as your brain tries to extract meaning from the image that it sees, the static image. So all the dynamics you see are just internal computational dynamics of the brain.
So it's not a similarity matrix then?
No, it is a similarity matrix. It is how the responses of the brain change in relation to one another. So let's say you show an elephant and a pineapple, and at 100 milliseconds, the brain thinks those are very similar, and 150 milliseconds, the brain thinks they're very different. So depending on how the code in V4 changes over time, this structure will change also, because V4 will emphasize different aspects of the world in different time points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get it. Thank you.
Okay. So we can quantify this, but I think you've seen quite clearly that in this movie that there's not much happening here to the left, right? It has a tiny bit of like change in the start, which is the nonlinearity there, and that just hangs out at a good average, right? So we thought, really feed-forward networks shouldn't be used if you're interested in recurrence and dynamics, and so this is just quantifying it. We really should be thinking of recurrence more. So I want to spend like 6 minutes about recurrence again in a more computational perspective, and then wrap up. So now I make this strong statement that if you're interested in modeling the brain, you should really be using recurrent models, because feed-forward models, even if we force them to, are not able to go through the same dynamics as what you see in V4. And the same is true for, as you see here, early visual cortex, V4, IT, all across the ventral stream, that's true. Now, the next thing we did was to think of computational benefits of recurrence. And that's kind of closing that loop again, trying to make ML better by thinking of biological features, but also asking, does recurrent connectivity actually add to the computational power of a model? So here's, this is Courtney Sporer, used to be a PhD student in the lab. Here's a feed-forward model, just a regular feed-forward convolutional model. And now let's just add lateral connections to it, right? So now each unit can talk to its neighboring units in the feature in the layer. And now we can train these two models on a given task. And I could tell you the lateral connections add because that model is better. But then I would also have to tell you that the bottom-up model is 11 million parameters and the lateral model is 30 million parameters. And then you would say, well, of course it does better because you've given it 3 times as many parameters. It's just a more powerful model, silly, right? And so we added 3 more feed-forward models. BK is increasing the kernel size in the early layers specifically. BF is adding double the feature maps to each layer, and BD is adding depth. So we just double the layers, right? And so BK has 40 million parameters, BF also, and BD has 30 million SBL, right? So these are also quite parameter-rich models, but they are unified by the view that they're all feed-forward versus lateral connections. So the question now becomes, do recurrent connections give you a better, bang for the buck? Do they give you more computational power per parameter, right? And that's what we want to look at next. So we trained these on EcoSet and ImageNet, two large-scale classification tasks. And you can see here to the left that B performs on the test set, top one accuracy at that, I don't know, 58 point something % accuracy. And then you see BK performs at 56. It's triple as many parameters, but it's worse. Why is that? Shout, you can just shout it.
Anybody wants to shout?
Let's say together, it's overfitting, right? It's using its parameters. It's using its parameters for stupid stuff, right? Not stuff that generalizes, but overfitting to the training data. And that's why its test performance is worse. If you add more feature maps, you get better. You get at 60% accuracy. If you add depth, which is something that people have observed in the past, right? Adding more, there's this meme, add more layers, then it gets better. We get at 62, 3 something. And if you add lateral connections, however, you get at 264, right? So you do better with the same amount of parameters than if you just make the model deeper. Now, this is an interesting plot here to the right. What we can do is to ask how many floating point operations are these models actually doing? And you can see, and for which accuracy. So you can see 3 points, the B model, BF, and BD. We left out BK because it was overfitting anyways. So these 3 models have 1 point, right? They need a certain amount of floating point operations to give you a certain accuracy. With a recurrent model, you can stop it at various different time points. You can stop it after 1 time step and ask, how good are you? And that will require some floating point operations. And if you can run it for longer, requiring more floating point operations, and ask again, how accurate are you? And what you get then is this sort of curve from the recurrent model that tells you that if you let it run for longer, you'll get better, right? You go from the bottom left to the top right. So that's nice. But one thing you see also, and that was interesting to us, is that it sort of almost crosses through the feed-forward models. Right? What does that mean? That means that at the same number of floating point operations, your recurrent model is as good as the feed-forward models, but you can choose to let it run for longer and then get better. Right? So what does that mean also? That means that we can also now probe recurrent models for reaction times. Right? You can ask, look at the probability distribution at the output, and you can compute, let's say, the entropy of that probability distribution. Again, if the probability distribution is uniform, entropy will be high. If the probability distribution at the output is, just one category having high probability, everything is low, you'll have very low entropy, right? So now you can run the model until it has reached a certain entropy threshold, and you can ask, how many time steps did you need to reach that, level of accuracy? And then you can compare that to human reaction times. Does that make sense?
Many nods.
Okay, good. So that's what we did. We went to a colleague, Jan, who's now in Montreal, and he had collected reaction times of people asking whether things were animate or inanimate, right? And you get this animate, this distribution basically. And then we trained our models on the same task. Tell us whether something's animate or inanimate, not using those stimuli, but a different stimulus set to do this task. And then we asked, okay, how many time steps per stimulus here does it take the model to come up with an answer? And does that correlate with reaction times of humans? And it turned out that this is, human consistency. So across these images, humans correlate in their reaction times at about 0.4, let's say. So if you correlate, the reaction times of one person with another person, it would be about 0.4. And if we use our recurrent models, we're at 0.2. That's like half. So that's bad news, but it's also good news because we're halfway there. And so the important thing is, however, that not we have solved this, that we clearly haven't, but that the recurrent models outperformed all of the feed-forward models that we had tested. They were better at predicting reaction times. Now, if you have listened, you may wonder, how on earth would you get a reaction time from a feed-forward network, right? Because it only gives you one response at one time point. What we did here was a bit of a trickery. We basically took the feed-forward model, and at every layer of the feed-forward model, we trained a readout to do the task. And we ran through the model step by step and asked, at which layer can you do this? And then we took that as a reaction time, because there's no other way really to properly to get reaction times out of this. And so here again, the take-home message was that recurrence really helps, not only in terms of performance and mirroring neural dynamics, but also in terms of mirroring human behavior. And this has been nicely replicated and expanded by Lynn Sørensen in Amsterdam recently. So this, I think, is a very fruitful way of thinking about computations. Okay, I'll skip over the final project that I wanted to talk about and put some final thoughts, which will take me 30 seconds. So first of all, I tried to convince you today that Neuroconnectionism is a research program. It's not just one, like with a lot of people that put thought into this. It's not like one group downloading Alexnet and just throwing it at neural data. It's actually people thinking deeply about the implications, about the tools we have, about the implications for different objectives. And it's different from engineering. We're not after, high benchmark performance. And it's also different from connectionist models that are using very simplified small scale models to mirror sort of behavior or learning. We would like to do the whole thing, including mapping onto neural data. That's why we call it Neuroconnectionism, because inside it's still, of course, connectionist models. It's deep neural networks. And so we, in this paper that we'll put out shortly, we make the claim that looking at deep nets, a single deep net instance, and showing, well, but there's adversarial examples, or there's shape stronger in humans than in models who do texture selectivity or so. Those are very interesting points. They don't negate the whole framework. They don't negate the whole research program. Those are interesting shortcomings that we urgently and really need to address going forward, but they're not negating the whole idea of using deep nets. And so we think of it in if you're familiar with the philosophy of science, with a sort of Lakatoshian view on science, which is there's a core research program that you don't touch. We think ANNs are sort of where it's at. Maybe not today's ANNs, but where we can take them. And then you have a belt of certain hypotheses you want to test. How far can we get with feed forward? Do we need recurrence? And so on and so forth. And that belt changes over time. So shortcomings in that sort of perspective are signposts and roadblocks, and research programs need to be evaluated based on whether they are progressive. Do they make new predictions or not? And there's a ton of examples in the paper of where ANNs have made new predictions about the brain that turned out to be true. Okay, with that, I would like to thank all the members of the lab, our funding body, of course, and all of you for your attention and good questions. Thank you.
So Tim, thanks a lot. I hope you heard that round of applause.
I've seen it.
That's good enough, I guess.
Yeah.
I think we have time for a question, if there is another one. Yes, we have one in the audience.
Can I ask a quick question, or we have time for multiple questions?
You have time for a question. There's one in the chat, but it's more a comment than a question. So I'll read that and ignore it. Not ignore it, but not comment on it, because it is a comment.
Is it okay if I ask a question first, or
yes?
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Because yeah. Okay, so I was just wondering what the recurrence, like if you thought about the functional role of the recurrence, besides being something that you find in the brain, what do you think it adds to the feed forward?
You know what? That's the project I jumped over. So in that, I won't go into detail, but it's literally the computational role of recurrence.
Yeah,
it's the project I jumped over. There's a postdoc in the lab, Sushrit Thorat, who worked on ideas of what feedback connections, multiplicative gain and feedback connections could be doing. And one of the things he found is that over time, they start to filter out parts of the image that are not required or not relevant for the task at hand, for instance. So you can ask these sort of questions, and this is like our first kind of step in this direction. So I'm sorry I had to jump over this project. It's a fun project, but yeah.
Okay, I'll read the paper. Thank you.
Thanks. Let me see. So oh, more questions.
Yes.
Yes, there's another one to do.
I would like to ask if there are like similar research with continuous inputs, like
Yes. That's the short answer. The long answer is so the project by Lynn that I just talked about is trying to replicate RSVP sort of behavior, right? Where you have a steady stream of input, and that's how you probe people. And she expanded these models to deal with, you know, continuous streams. There's also a lot of ongoing work in some of the labs that were on the list of people that think of actual video inputs and unsupervised objectives and so on and so forth. And we have a preprint out where we think of sequences of inputs and recurrent models, and what if you force the model to be energy efficient, so have as little activation as possible and as little synaptic transmission as possible, what the model would do with, you know, video inputs or sequences of inputs if you put that constraint on. And then it turns out they learn something like predictive coding by themselves.
That's really cool. Thank you. I'll check the preprint.
Thanks. So I must say I probably didn't do the comment in the chat justice, because there is actually a question. So they link to a paper and say the paper uses top-down connections as learning signals for lower hierarchies in an SNN. In their model, neuron spikes encode the forward and learning signal at the same time. Have you and others tried to use gradient information of ANNs together with forward recurrent information to predict neurophysiological recordings? Claudius, can you clarify whether you mean that whether we use gradient information and try to find gradient information in neurophysiological recordings? So specifically trying to find out how the brain learns through a model, or what's the actual target of the question?
So the target was that, yeah, at the moment, as you showed, we can only explain like 50 or 60% of the variance that we find in the recordings. And after reading a paper, I wondered if by also using the gradient information, like for example, by propagating a lot of images back from a test data set and also trying to predict from those as well, our recordings, could we like improve the accuracy or the explainable variance?
Yeah, so short answer is yes. So the framework allows us to do that. We need to be careful that if we put more neural data into these models, that we don't kind of lie to ourselves, right? So that's why we try to keep the model training usually quite separate from the neural data, other than the one project that I showed you where we explicitly contrasted architectures. So that's one caveat maybe, but separating out learning signals and inference, for instance, is something that's been considered in the field for quite a while. To think of how can learning happen in a model and inference at the same time. How can you, so another PhD in the lab is thinking of continuous learning, right? How can we have a continuously well-functioning system while taking on new information without destroying old stuff, right? That's also a century-old question. But yeah, so this is definitely stuff that's been considered in the field.
Okay, thanks.
All right, and I think at this point we should also wrap up. So let's thank Tim again.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for this very interesting talk.
Great.
And
have fun at your summer school.
Thanks.
Bye.